The man kissing my wife in the reflection of my office window was my younger brother. I did not turn around. Below us, the Tagus looked black and expensive, the kind of water that makes people believe money can float forever. In the glass, I watched Isabel lean into Mateo as if she had been doing it for years, not weeks. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that almost felt merciful, that betrayal is never one decision. It is a staircase. You only notice it when the other person is already at the bottom. Mateo had one hand at her waist. She had her eyes closed. My father's portrait hung on the wall behind me, reflected above their shoulders. He had been dead for 9 months, and there he was again, watching his 2 sons destroy each other over the company he spent 40 years building. I kept my eyes on the glass and signed the shipping authorization on my desk. Only then did I say, very quietly, "You can come in now." They separated at once. That was the humiliating part. Not the kiss, the speed, the choreography. They were practiced enough to be careless and quick enough to recover. When I turned, Mateo was already reaching for the door handle as though he had just arrived, and Isabel was smoothing her blouse with the composure of a woman who had spent too many years standing beside men who believed they controlled rooms. Mateo smiled first. He always did. "You're still here," he said. "I thought you'd gone home." "I was working." He laughed lightly, as if work were a private eccentricity of mine, and not the only reason Duarte Port Logistics still existed. "Always." Isabel stood in the doorway without looking directly at me. "The guests are arriving downstairs," she said. "The foundation dinner starts in 20 minutes. She sounded calm. Too calm. My wife had a gift for tone. She could make concern sound elegant, affection sound formal, and lies sound like the kindest version of the truth. I looked at her left hand. No wedding ring. That was new. "Then you should both go down," I said. Mateo lingered. "We still need to talk about Aurelius." Of course we did. Aurelius Capital had been circling us for 6 months, smiling their white smiles, praising our legacy position and regional dominance, which was financier language for, "We will buy the bones of your father and rent them back to you as nostalgia." Mateo wanted the sale. I did not. That disagreement had already become the polite version of war. "Tomorrow," I said. "It should be tonight." "Tomorrow." He studied me for half a second too long. Mateo had charm in the way some men have expensive watches. It looked natural until you counted how often he checked that you were looking. At 38, he was everything investors liked in a second son: warm, flexible, hungry. Our father used to say I had the mind for operations, and Mateo had the face for forgiveness. It sounded like praise at the time. Now I understood it better. "Fine," he said. "Tomorrow." Isabel was already turning away. I watched the back of her neck, the line of it, the familiar coolness in her posture. 7 years of marriage, and I could still read the precise degree of her distance by how she held her shoulders. She paused at the door. "Don't be late," she said. Then they left together. I stood alone in the office that had once belonged to my father and looked at his portrait again. He was smiling the way dead men always seem to smile in old photographs, with the confidence of someone who no longer has to live with the consequences of his principles. My father, Henrique Duarte, had built the company from one customs brokerage contract and a borrowed warehouse by the river. He came from nothing and trusted almost no one. By the time he died, Duarte Port Logistics controlled enough terminals, trucking routes, and bonded storage to make foreign capital interested and local politicians attentive. He called it resilience. Other people called it power. When I was 26, he put me in charge of operations and told me 3 things. Never borrow from a man who wants your gratitude. Never confuse appetite with vision. And if your own blood starts speaking to outsiders in the language of opportunity, count the silver. I thought he was being theatrical. My father often was. What I did not understand then was that his most dramatic quality was not his temper. It was how rarely he wasted one. I loosened my tie and looked around the office. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The same map of shipping routes hung behind the desk. The same brass clock ticked on the bookshelf. The same river moved outside the glass, black and patient. There are moments in a man's life when grief and humiliation arrive so close together they become difficult to separate. Standing there, I could not tell whether the pressure in my chest belonged to my father or my wife or my brother. Perhaps that was the point. Betrayal is most effective when it enters through an existing wound. I should tell you this plainly. Isabel did not begin as a villain. Neither did Mateo. People rarely do. Isabel was 29 when I met her at a museum fundraiser in Porto. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. That mattered to me because it meant I noticed other things first. Her discipline, her restraint, the way she listened without flattering. She worked in cultural development then, raising money for institutions wealthy men like to be seen loving. At the end of the evening, she told me, "You look like a man who apologizes by buying buildings." I asked her if that was meant as an insult. "No," she said, "just an observation." I married her 11 months later. For a long time, we were good in the quiet ways that do not impress anyone else. We ate late dinners. We traveled badly and laughed about it. She read in bed while I answered messages I should have ignored. On Sunday mornings, she made coffee too strong and wore my shirts without asking. We did not have children. We tried once, then again, and then we stopped speaking about it in the direct language people use when they still believe pain can be managed with honesty. After the second miscarriage, something in our house changed its shape. Not loudly. Nothing dramatic broke. We simply became careful with each other, and then efficient, and then polite. Grief, when it is shared badly, becomes architecture. You find yourself living inside rooms you did not realize you were building. Then my father fell ill. For 18 months, the company ate everything that remained of me. His hospitals, the board, the debt restructuring, the labor dispute in Setúbal, the customs investigation in Signs. I slept at the office more than once. Isabel stopped asking when I would be home. Mateo started handling more of the investor relations, which was supposed to be temporary, the way most permanent mistakes first introduce themselves. He and Isabel worked together on the family foundation after my father's diagnosis. Gala dinners, donor events, heritage campaigns. The company made money. The foundation made us look like people deserving to keep it. I knew they spent time together. I even appreciated it. Mateo could make her laugh during a period when I had forgotten how. I tell you this because I do not believe in innocent narrators. I was betrayed, yes. I was also absent. There is no honor in pretending I was not. But absence explains a wound. It does not excuse the knife. By the time I went downstairs to the foundation dinner that night, I had already made two decisions. The first was that I would not confront either of them until I understood the business side of the betrayal. The second was that if the two betrayals were connected, I would not forgive either. The dinner was held in our Alfama residence, the old family house my father restored after he became rich enough to fetishize his own beginnings. The courtyard was full of warm light and expensive voices. Donors, municipal officials, old shipping men with red faces, women Isabel had once charmed into philanthropy, junior bankers who still believed culture could wash the smell off money. I moved through them smiling when required. Isabel stood near the center of the room in a black dress I had bought her in Milan 2 winters earlier. Mateo was 3 steps away, talking to a fund manager, relaxed in the body the way dishonest men always are when they believe they have chosen the timing of the truth. When our eyes met across the room, neither of them looked ashamed. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted shame from them, because I realized then how long I had been excluded. Around midnight, after the last donor left and the house staff began clearing glassware, Isabel found me in the library. You disappeared, she said. I was here. Her gaze moved over me carefully. You've been strange all evening. Have I? Yes. I poured myself a drink. I did not offer her one. You and Mateo seem close, I said. It landed between us with less noise than I would have imagined. She did not flinch. That was when I knew it was old. We work together, she said. That isn't what I asked. A long silence followed. She walked to the mantel and touched the bronze horse my father used to keep there, a vulgar thing from some auction house in London that he loved because everyone else hated it. How much did you see? She asked. Enough. She nodded once, almost with relief. Then I won't insult you. I laughed then, not loudly, just enough to hear what it sounded like in my own mouth. That would be a nice change. She turned toward me. There was no panic in her face. Only fatigue. I wasn't planning to tell you like this. No. I imagine you were planning to tell me after I signed something. That was the first moment her expression changed. Only a little, but I saw it. If this is about Aurelius, she said, that discussion was always going to happen. With you and my brother already in my bed and my boardroom? Her jaw tightened. Don't reduce this. I'm trying to improve it. She came closer then, close enough that I could smell her perfume, close enough to remember loving her without bitterness. You want the ugly version? She asked softly. Fine. Here it is. I got tired of talking to a man who only came alive when numbers were bleeding. I got tired of being needed for appearances and ignored for everything else. Mateo listened. Mateo was there. Mateo was my brother. Yes, she said, and there was anger in it now. He was. I looked at her for a long time. There are sentences that end marriages. Not because they are the cruelest things said, but because they reveal how long the speaker has already been gone. How long? I asked. She did not answer. How long, Isabel? 8 months. My father had been dead 9. I nodded. Was he there before the funeral too? She looked away. That was enough. I set my glass down very carefully because my hand had started to shake. You should go to bed, I said. She stared at me. That's all? No, I said. That's just all you get tonight. She left the library without another word. I stood there until the ice in my glass disappeared. The next morning I called Clara Nunes. Clara had been my father's lawyer for 22 years and my legal counsel for the last 7. She was 51, unsentimental, and incapable of performative sympathy, which is why I trusted her. She arrived at the office at 9:30 with a leather folder and the expression of a woman who had already canceled 2 more pleasant ways to spend her morning. You sound calm, she said when she sat down. I'm practicing. That usually means I should worry. Probably. I told her about Isabel and Mateo first, because there is no point discussing corporate strategy with a lawyer while pretending the emotional motive is irrelevant. Clara listened without interruption. When I finished, she folded her hands and asked only one question. Do you believe the affair intersects with the sale? Yes. Then we start with money. We did. By noon, she had my finance controller, João Ferraz, in the room with us, and the first set of irregular reports open on the table. João was one of those men whose decency had survived accounting, which made him nearly saintly. He had been at Duarte longer than Mateo had been sober enough to wear a tie. He looked embarrassed to be there. I didn't want to bring half-formed concerns, he said, but there are consulting fees I can't reconcile. Mar Alto Advisory, 6 payments over 4 months. Large enough to matter, small enough not to trigger a board review by themselves. Who owns it? Clara asked. We couldn't identify directly. I can, she said. By 3 in the afternoon, she could. Mar Alto Advisory belonged to a holding structure in Cascais, which belonged to a nominee arrangement in Luxembourg, which, once properly unfolded by someone who disliked being lied to, led quietly back to two beneficiaries, Mateo Duarte and Isabel Duarte. Equal stakes. I remember not feeling surprise, just heat. The consulting fees were not the whole thing. They never are. Mar Alto had been positioned to receive integration compensation if Aurelius acquired the company, a success fee disguised as transition support, legal on paper if disclosed, fraud if concealed. Worse, there were draft side letters referencing terminal redevelopment rights on land my father had repeatedly refused to sell. Heritage land, family land. The old riverside warehouses he used to call the bones of the company. Mateo was not just trying to sell Duarte. He was trying to get rich personally for helping outsiders carve it open. And my wife had signed part of the structure. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Tell me something useful." Clara opened another file. "Useful is this," she said. "He's moved too fast. The board packet for the Aurelius vote contains an authorization draft he assumes you will sign after Friday's memorial dinner. Without your signature, he does not control enough voting rights to force the sale. With the concealed side agreements and the undeclared conflict, I can suspend him for fiduciary breach if we have board support." "Do we?" 3 of 7 immediately. Maybe 5 once they smell liability. "And Isabel?" "She's not a board member. She's easier. Employment breach, concealment, collusion, reputational exposure. The harder part is not removing her. The harder part is deciding whether you want to destroy her." I looked out the window. The river moved like a dark thought. "She made that decision before I did," I said. Clara watched me for a moment. "That isn't an answer." "No," I said. "It's the answer." She left me with documents and instructions. Emergency board consultation Thursday. Freeze on Mateo's external authorizations if possible. Quiet review of all investor communications. Secure digital evidence before anyone felt cornered enough to become clever. But I did not go home after she left. I stayed in the office until nearly midnight, reading every message trail, every draft, every version of the future they had been building without me. You learn things in documents that people do not say aloud. Mateo had described me to Aurelius as operationally strong but emotionally anchored to legacy assets. Isabel had written that my decision-making had become increasingly sentimental since Henrique's death. Sentimental. It is a humiliating thing to discover that the people sleeping beside your life have already started translating you for strangers. Thursday evening, the board met in a private room above our old warehouse by the river, the one my father never permitted to be renovated because he liked remembering discomfort as if it were a moral credential. 5 directors came. That was enough. Clara spoke first. Joan presented the transfers. I said very little. I did not need to. Men who tolerate conflict of interest in theory become remarkably principled when their own names appear beside it in discovery. By the end of the meeting, the board had authorized 3 things: an immediate internal investigation, a temporary suspension of Mateo's authority pending review, and, more importantly, my emergency transfer of voting control into an employee trust structure my father once drafted and never used. It would lock any hostile sale for 10 years unless approved not just by the family, but by the Workforce Council and 2 independent directors. It was, in effect, a steel door behind velvet curtains. Mateo would find it beautiful only after it closed on him. Friday was my father's birthday. He had been dead long enough for people to stop speaking of him with tears and start speaking of him with strategy, which is how men like him are actually buried. Every year, even before he died, we gathered at Warehouse 3 by the river for a family dinner and a staff toast. Not lavish. My father despised lavishness when other people paid for it and considered it vulgar when he did. So the room was always simple. Long table, white linens, Old photographs on easels, good wine, better silence. This year, Isabel organized it. Of course she did. By 7 in the evening, the room was full. Board members, senior staff. My mother, pale and elegant in the way widows become when sorrow finally settles into posture. A few longtime clients, 2 Aurelius representatives. Mateo near the head of the table, confident again. Isabel in deep green silk, composed enough to make doubt seem uncivilized. When she saw me arrive, something in her face tightened. Not fear, recognition. She knew I had become too calm. That is the problem with betraying someone who knows your weather. They also know when the sky has changed. I kissed my mother's cheek and took my seat. Dinner began. No one mentioned my father immediately. The first course passed in the soft hypocrisy of old money conversation, port congestion, elections, the absurdity of labor unions until those same unions were needed for moral credibility. Isabel moved through the room, speaking to guests with professional grace. Mateo poured warmth over everyone. Aurelius smiled like a patient knife. At one point, Mateo leaned toward me and said, "You look better." I slept. Good. We all need a clear head tonight. That was almost enough to make me admire him. Almost. After dessert, the room settled into the ceremonial pause my father always demanded before the first toast. For years, it had been his favorite part of any dinner. The moment before language, when he could still imagine everyone was about to say what he deserved. Mateo stood first. Of course he did. He lifted his glass and began speaking about legacy, resilience, evolution. He was very good. He spoke of our father's courage, his appetite for risk, his refusal to let sentiment impede growth. He spoke of responsibility to the future. He spoke of honoring the past by refusing to become trapped inside it. Several people nodded. Aurelius nodded most of all. Then Mateo turned toward me with brotherly warmth and said, "Raphael and I have not always agreed on how best to protect what our father built. But families argue because what matters most is worth arguing over. Tonight I believe we're finally aligned." He raised his glass slightly in my direction. I looked at him and thought, "You poor foolish man. You think alignment is love." When he sat down, the room waited for me. I stood. I did not bring notes. "My father hated speeches," I said. "He believed most of them were vanity disguised as memory." A few people smiled. He also believed that the only serious test of a family business comes after the founder dies. While he is alive, loyalty is often just obedience with better tailoring. Afterward, you discover who loved the work, who loved the power, and who was only waiting for the old man's hand to leave the door. The room went still. I let the silence do its work. My father was not easy. He was not gentle. He made admiration expensive. But he did leave us one useful inheritance. He taught us to examine appetite closely. Mateo had stopped smiling. Isabel was standing near the far end of the table with one hand resting against a chair back, still composed, but no longer relaxed. "So I examined it," I said, "very closely." I nodded once toward Clara, who had been seated halfway down the table like any other invited guest. She rose and stepped forward with 2 folders, a simple gesture, the kind that changes the air in a room. The first folder went in front of Mateo, the second went in front of Isabel. Neither opened theirs immediately. That, more than anything, revealed their fear. I continued. Inside those folders are documents relating to undisclosed conflicts of interest, concealed advisory compensation, fiduciary breaches, and coordination with external investors against the declared interests of this company and this family. There are side agreements, beneficiary structures, payment records, communications. Enough, I believe, to remove confusion from the room. One of the Aurelius men set down his glass. Mateo opened his folder at last. He turned one page, then another. The color left his face slowly, as if it were ashamed to go. Isabel did not sit. She opened hers standing up, and I watched her eyes move down the page until they reached the divorce petition clipped neatly at the back. Only then did she look at me. There are many expressions a woman can wear when a marriage ends. What she had was not grief. It was impact. A controlled woman discovering that control had changed addresses. I kept speaking. As of 4:30 this afternoon, my voting shares were transferred into the Duarte Employee Heritage Trust under a dormant governance structure drafted by my father and approved by the board in emergency session last night. Any sale of controlling assets now requires expanded approvals you do not possess and cannot manufacture. I turned toward the Aurelius representatives. You were not informed of that before dinner. I apologize for the surprise. I believed it would be useful to conduct this part of the conversation in the presence of all interested parties. One of them, a silver-haired man named Halloran, cleared his throat. Aurelius was not aware of any undisclosed compensation arrangement, he said carefully, nor of any governance action taken this afternoon. No, I said, you were not. He looked at Mateo with the kind of cold professionalism rich men reserve for other rich men who have become liabilities. Mateo finally spoke. You sanctimonious bastard. His voice was low, but the whole table heard it. I almost appreciated the honesty. Probably, I said, but not a careless one. He rose so quickly his chair scraped the floor. You think this is strategy? You think this is leadership? Locking the company into a museum because father filled your head with his poverty fantasies? No, I said. I think it is containment. Containment of what? You. His mouth hardened. Then, because humiliation makes reckless men reach for truth the way drowning men reach for air, he said the thing he should not have said in front of my mother. He never wanted it to be you, Mateo snapped. He settled for you. There's a difference. The room froze. My mother closed her eyes. And there it was. Not money, not Isabel, not even Aurelius. The original wound. My father had trusted me with the company because I was steadier. Mateo had known it all his adult life. He had been loved, yes, perhaps more easily, but not chosen. That sort of knowledge does not leave a man. It ferments. It looks for a sweeter story to live inside. I nodded once. Maybe, I said, but he still didn't choose you. Mateo stared at me with a hatred so naked it almost looked clean. Then he turned to Isabel as if she might still be the surface on which he could stand. She wasn't. She was still looking at the folder, at the signatures, at the clean administrative death of a future she had helped design. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost quiet enough to be mistaken for dignity. You did all this to punish us. I looked at her. No, I said. I did it because punishment is emotional. This is structural. She flinched. Just slightly. That was all I wanted. Clara stepped in then, precise and calm, explaining the immediate suspension measures, the litigation hold, the access revocations, the expectation that all company devices and records be surrendered by morning. Halloran from Aurelius spoke again, withdrawing current acquisition discussions pending review. Board members avoided everyone's eyes. Senior staff stared fixedly at the tablecloth, the way loyal employees do when family shame spills into professional light. No one shouted. That was important to me. I did not want chaos. Chaos gives traitors the excuse of confusion. I wanted sequence, consequence, recognition. At some point, my mother stood. She was a small woman, and grief had made her smaller, but when she spoke, the room listened because my father had spent 40 years making the mistake of underestimating her in public. That is enough, she said. Everyone fell silent. She looked first at Mateo, then at Isabel, then at me. You have all managed, she said, to make your father's birthday about your own damage. He would be furious. I am simply tired. There was no comfort in her voice, only judgment, distributed without favoritism. She turned to me. Take me home, Raphael. I went to her immediately. As I helped her into her coat, Isabel said my name. I did not answer. Mateo did not say goodbye to anyone. He walked out into the Lisbon night with his folder under his arm and the particular stiffness men acquire when they still believe anger can reverse paperwork. Isabel remained behind for several minutes after he left. I saw her through the warehouse doorway, standing alone under the hanging lamps, one hand pressed against the back of a chair, as if the room were moving beneath her. Then she followed him out. I drove my mother home along the river in silence. Near the cathedral, she said, "Did you know?" "For how long?" "At dinner." "Yes." "No," she said. "I mean about them. Before." I kept my eyes on the road. "No." She nodded slowly. "Then I suppose you had one honest surprise left." At her house, before getting out of the car, she touched my sleeve. "When your father was 45, she said, his brother tried to force him out of the customs business in Les Soins. Did you know that?" "No." "He never told you because he was ashamed of how much he enjoyed winning." That sentence stayed with me, not because it comforted me, because it didn't. When I reached the house Isabel and I had shared, the locks had already been changed, at my instruction. I had done it at 6:30, before the dinner, while she was dressing for my father's birthday in the bedroom where we had once tried to build a life. Clara called it practical. I knew better. It was practical, yes. It was also cruel in the small domestic way that lingers longer than public humiliation. Her clothes were still inside, her books, her perfumes, the porcelain bowl from Seville, the scarf she wore in winter because I once said the color made her look less guarded. I stood in the entry hall alone and understood all at once that revenge often arrives disguised as administration. 3 days later, Mateo's suspension became permanent. 2 weeks later, the board voted him out. A month later, civil proceedings began. He threatened countersuits. He accused me of manipulation, of emotional instability, of using governance law as personal vengeance. He was not entirely wrong. That was the difficulty. The facts were on my side. Purity was not. Isabel moved into a rented apartment near Príncipe Real. Her lawyer proposed terms. Mine answered. There were no children to divide, which felt less like mercy than inventory. Once, 6 weeks after the dinner, she asked to meet. I chose a hotel lounge because I no longer trusted private rooms with people who had once known how to injure me gently. She arrived 10 minutes late, wearing gray, looking thinner and more beautiful in the way loss sometimes refines the very people who cause it. For a while, we spoke about documents. Always the documents first. It is easier to discuss signatures than love after love has embarrassed itself. Then she asked, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "I don't have anything that simple." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't plan for it to become what it became. People say that when they mean they lost control of a version they liked better. That's not fair." "No," I said. "It isn't." She was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking at me, she said, "I did love you." I believed her. That was the worst part. Because love is not always the opposite of betrayal. Sometimes it is only what makes betrayal worth arranging carefully. "I know," I said. She finally met my eyes. "And you? Did you ever love me more than the company?" I could have lied. I had earned at least that much vanity. But there are humiliations a man should not outsource. "Sometimes," I said. "Not enough times in a row." Tears rose in her eyes but did not fall. Isabel had always believed in the elegance of unfinished things. When she left, she touched the table once, lightly, as if checking whether it was real. I never saw her alone again. Mateo called twice in the months that followed. The first time, I let it ring. The second time, I answered. He did not bother with apology. "Are you happy now?" he asked. It was late. I was in my father's old office, though by then it was only mine. "No," I said. He laughed once bitterly. "Good." Then he hung up. I sat there in the dark afterward, phone in my hand, and thought about how childish we become when the larger explanations fail us. We still want suffering to be symmetrical. We still want pain to prove something. We still want someone else's emptiness to make ours feel justified. It never does. The company survived. That is the line businessmen use when they want to call a wound an outcome. We restructured, reduced exposure, repaired client confidence, lost some people, kept the right ones. The employee trust calmed the market and enraged the kind of investors who confuse access with destiny. My father's riverside warehouses remained ours, though now they cost more to defend and meant less to me than they had before. Victory altered them. That is another thing no one tells you. When you finally protect what was threatened, it does not return to innocence. It carries your methods inside it. Winter came. Lisbon became silver and damp and quieter than it had any right to be. One evening in December, I went alone to Warehouse 3 after everyone else had left. The table was gone. The lamps were low. Outside, the river moved under a hard sky, indifferent and exact. I stood where Mateo had stood during the toast. I stood where Isabel had opened the folder. I stood where my father should have stood if he had wanted to prevent any of it and been the sort of man who prevented rather than prepared. Then I laughed once, very softly, because in the end I had become exactly what the family required and exactly what it cost to preserve it. My father would have understood that. He might even have admired it. My mother, I think, understood something harder. A week after Christmas, she came to the office with a tin of almond biscuits she had not made in years and sat across from me without speaking for a while. Finally, she said, "Your father would have called what you did necessary." I waited. "And you?" She looked at the river outside the glass. "I call it expensive." That was the most generous thing anyone said to me about it. Sometimes people imagine revenge as a hot act, sudden, satisfying, a blow returned, a humiliation balanced. They are wrong. Real revenge, the kind that leaves no blood and still empties a house, is colder than that. It is schedules changed, locks replaced, authority transferred, smiles answered at the proper volume while signatures move beneath them like knives beneath linen. It is the discipline to wait until the other person has fully invested in the future you are about to remove. And when it is over, there is no music, no cleansing, no restoration, only order, and the private knowledge that order is not the same thing as peace. I still dream about the reflection sometimes, not the kiss itself, the seconds before I turned. That suspended moment when the truth was visible only in glass, when I could still have chosen ignorance and kept my life in one piece a little longer. But that is the childish fantasy of older men, that ignorance would have preserved what truth destroyed. It wouldn't have. The marriage was already gone. My brother was already selling pieces of me to strangers. The staircase had already been built. All I did was make sure they were the ones who fell the rest of the way. And if you ask whether it was worth it, I can only answer you honestly. Worth is a language for merchants. What I wanted was proportion. What I got was silence. In some families, that is the closest thing to justice you will ever own.